If you're new to the world of Total War Warhammer, you may wonder what's the best difficulty to play on for you. And also, what is actually the difference between the difficulties, whether you play on easy, hard or legendary? What's actually changing? Well, that's what I'm gonna show you. I'll also tell you what difficulty I prefer and which difficulty I think newer players should maybe start on. So let us begin. So first of all, we have the campaign difficulty. Easy, normal, hard, very hard, or legendary. Campaign difficulty being everything that's going on the campaign map itself. The controlling of territory, the economy, managing your kingdom. That's one side of the difficulty. The other side is the battle difficulty. Easy, normal, hard, or very hard. This will affect the units in battle on the battlefield for both the player and the AI. We also now have the Chaos Invasion difficulty, but we'll look at that later on. We'll start with the battle difficulty as it is the simpler of the two subjects. So the first big thing that gets affected in battle is the leadership for both the AI and the player. If you have battle difficulty on normal, things will be very even. Nobody gains any leadership buffs or penalties. It'll be basically the same as custom battles or multiplayer. If you drop the difficulty down to easy, the AI will get -4 leadership to all of its units in all of its armies when in battle, making them easier to rout, meaning that the player doesn't have to work so hard to break enemy units. And as the player, you'll gain +4 leadership to all of your units, meaning that they won't rout so easily and you should have an easier time beating the enemy. If you go up to hard difficulty, it goes the other way. The AI now gets +4 leadership and you get -2. So now enemy units are a little bit harder to break and rout, whilst your army is going to be a little bit more vulnerable to running away, but only a little bit. It's on very hard though, where the big difference comes in with +10 for AI units and -4 for all of your units, which is pretty big of a jump, at least for the AI. +10 leadership to all enemy units, that turns dwarf armies unbreakable. That turns Skaven slaves into low tier dwarfs in terms of how difficult it is to rout them. Not to mention that all of your units are going to have -4 leadership, making them more likely to run away. So leadership is one of the big things that gets affected, but that's not all. All of this stuff gets affected for the AI as well. Melee damage or weapon strength, melee attack, melee defense, charge bonus, and missile reload time. The only difficulty that doesn't get affected is normal, where there will be 0 changes to any of these stats. The same as with the leadership. For all other difficulties though, this happens. A whole bunch of changes to all of these stats depending on the difficulty. If you play on easy, you'll be reducing the normal stats by up to 20%. If you play on hard or very hard, you'll be increasing enemy AI stats by up to 20%. So to give an example, let's use melee attack, and let's say a unit has a melee attack of 40. On easy, that goes down to 0.8 of its normal value, so 80% of its normal value, which in this case would bring the enemy melee attack down to 32 instead of 40. A pretty big jump. On hard, a unit gets 1.1 of its normal value, so an extra 10%. In this case, that brings the melee attack to 44 on hard, and very hard an extra 15%, bringing it to 46. So fairly substantial changes which are really going to affect how you have to play a battle on different difficulties, because when you apply this sort of stuff to all of these stats, it's pretty big changes. On the melee defense on very hard, you can see it's 1.2. That means they get an extra 20% melee defense. That's going to make them a lot harder to kill, especially coupled up with that extra 10 leadership, remember. They get the extra 10 or 15% charge bonus on harder difficulties, 20% less on easy difficulty, faster or slower missile reload time for missile units, all this different stuff. So battle difficulty will obviously determine how hard you have to work in the battle. On easy, you can probably get away with just charging all of your units forward and barreling into the enemy. They'll likely break eventually, even if the matchups aren't that great. As you move into normal though, you will need to probably put a bit more focus on the matchups and make sure you're getting good ones for your units. And onto hard and very hard, you'll need to start really employing some tactics along with those good matchups. Some flanking, some hammer and anvil, some skirmishing, some harassing of the missiles, good application of magic. All these things are a bit more required as you move up the difficulties. Unless of course you're a cheeselord who brings armies of missiles or 20 mammoths. But we'll talk about that more later too. Now to campaign, where things can get a little bit more confusing, but we'll look at some of the simpler stuff. One of the more obvious things that you may have noticed on different difficulties is the difficulty level public order penalty on your settlements. As you can see here, it's -8 because this is a legendary campaign and that's the public order penalty it brings. And of course, the easier the difficulty, the less this penalty is. It's no big deal though, it's simple enough to solve. The harder the difficulty, the more public order buildings you'll probably have to construct, or technologies you'll have to research, or characters that spread public order. You'll just have to put more attention on bringing those things in your provinces. So that's one of the big things that affects you as the player. But the more substantial effects in campaign when you increase difficulty come for the AI. That is, as you've probably heard it put, the AI cheats, which technically it does, but it has to, otherwise there wouldn't be much of a game there and it wouldn't be very challenging. So what happens to the AI as we increase the difficulty? Well, firstly, the AI gets more growth, so it can develop its settlements faster and unlock better things quicker. It also gets a larger recruitment cap, meaning it can recruit more units per turn than our puny human-controlled factions. And it pays less for recruitment, so those units don't cost as much on initial recruitment. The AI also gets better replenishment for its armies. After a battle and it's taken some damage, it can have its armies back to full strength way quicker than you can, you loser. It also takes less attrition, from any kind of attrition, from snow, from vampires, from chaos. It'll take less of it than we do, goddammit. The AI units also gain more XP than we do, meaning they'll be triple gold chevroned before you've even left bronze. The AI also gets cheaper construction, so it doesn't have to fork out as much for its buildings. Those dodgy cash-in-hand builders are paying off for the AI. And as for these last two, these are the big ones. The AI pays less army upkeep, so its armies don't cost as much to run. Which is why when you see a faction with 1 settlement and 2 full stacks, or maybe 3 full stacks, you wonder, what the hell, why can't I do that? The answer is because you're a puny human. You'll have to start praying to the Omnissiah if you ever want to catch up. And lastly, quite simply, the AI gets better auto-resolve chances, so the higher the difficulty, the slight bit more favour the AI will have because of a difficulty penalty on the player. So that's some of the main things. There are a few other bits and bobs, but these are the main things that are happening. So when you increase the campaign difficulty, you're increasing all these bonuses for the AI. So you're ultimately stacking the odds against yourself by making all the factions out there in the world that little bit stronger. And I think it's a common misconception that the AI gets more money, which is how it has bigger armies, more armies, better units, whatever. When in fact, it doesn't get any more money, it just pays less for stuff. So it doesn't need as much money as we do. Which is why when you confederate another faction, you'll probably end up with a massive debt because you're not getting the reductions to upkeep that the AI does. So that's a bunch of stuff that mostly affects the AI, but also indirectly affects us as well. And there are a few things like this for the player as well that get adjusted with the difficulty, but nothing that substantial. All of this though is just the tip of the iceberg. There are some much bigger systems at play that affect the AI with increasing difficulty. Honestly, most of it's too difficult to explain in full, but it's not really something that matters that much. Anyway, you don't need to know it, it's not going to help you play the game any better, but the gist of it is this. The AI has a collection of managers, behaviors, and task priorities that are called personalities. Those personalities get assigned to every single faction. The difficulty that you choose can affect the personality that gets assigned to any particular faction. This will mostly determine what the faction prioritizes, where it decides to spend its money, when it decides to attack or defend, how aggressive it is, ultimately deciding how it interacts with you and other AI factions. Overall, you could consider the AI more aggressive as you increase the difficulty, and perhaps more hostile towards you, harder to strike a deal with in diplomacy, which overall is going to make your experience a little or a lot tougher. That's the gist of it anyway. The harder we make the difficulty, the harder people are going to be with us. And of course you couple that up with all the other bonuses like less upkeep, more growth, less cost for things, we'll have a much tougher experience all round. So that is most of the big stuff that affects battle difficulty and campaign difficulty. So which difficulty should you play on? The first thing I'll say is not to ever play on easy for battle or campaign. Because, in battle, like I said earlier, you don't really need to think about matchups if it's on easy. The reductions to the enemy are so great that you can just get away with anything pretty much. So unless you enjoy left-clicking then right-clicking your screen a bunch of times with no real thought into it, I'd play on anything but easy. Even if you're brand new to the game and you've never played Total War before, I still think easy is too easy. Maybe it's good for kids who just want to smash stuff up without any real thought, then it's probably good fun. The other problem with easy is that it kind of skews the reality of the game, because everything is made so much easier for you. When you move up a difficulty or try to play in multiplayer, when everything doesn't start instantly breaking for you, you're going to wonder what the hell's going on. You thought you were good, you were crushing it in easy, but oh no, you didn't learn anything about matchups playing on easy, so you don't know what's what. Normal and anything above is going to give you a much closer reality of the unit stats and their true performance. Although this is still somewhat untrue, because in campaign we have skill points for lords, and those skill points can be used to give more melee attack, more charge bonus, more melee defense, again kind of skewing the reality of what a unit could actually do. In campaign, easy is a little bit more forgivable, but I still think it makes the game a little bit too easy. Because even on the harder difficulties, you can kind of ignore some of the mechanics of the game and be just fine. So on easy, you can ignore this all completely, and it's just super easy anyway. But hey, maybe that's the experience you want, a super chilled out casual time, and there's nothing wrong with that if that's what you're after. But because you're playing a strategy game, I'll guess you probably don't mind a challenge. So if you're brand new, I'd say start on at least normal, or if you really like a good bit of a challenge, start on hard, because it's not that much harder than normal, to be honest. And both of these difficulties will give you a much closer reality to multiplayer as well, which means if you ever want to make the jump to playing multiplayer, or you just want to mess about against your friends, you'll have a much better understanding of the units and the tactics that are required to win battles. Now, when it comes to very hard and legendary, there's a few more things to think about. For very hard battle difficulty, I'd say avoid it, because it's hard for the wrong reasons. I used to play all my campaigns on very hard, and over time I've just found this more and more frustrating, because things don't act as they really should. With all the buffs to stats and leadership, like I mentioned earlier, Skaven slaves become low-tier dwarfs. Dwarf armies become entirely unbreakable. Even dwarf warriors will fight down to their last 2, 3 or 4 dwarfs before they'll rout and run away. Same with the lizard men, they become a nightmare on very hard, because they're just all unbreakable pretty much. And while I do enjoy a challenge, this isn't the kind of challenge that is really rewarding me in the right way. And I feel like I'm being cheated most of the time, no matter how well I play or how many tactics I use. Quite simply, I don't find it fun. That's why I personally recommend you don't play on very hard unless you really enjoy fighting dwarfs that never break. And as for very hard campaign difficulty, I think that's okay. It's not too much different to hard, to be honest, and isn't quite as frustrating and cheaty as legendary is, so very hard can be a good spot. Also, if you're into achievements, you get the ones for completing a campaign on very hard or legendary, if you're into that as well. That brings us to the legendary campaign difficulty. Is it worth your time, and is it the ultimate goal of campaign? Well, I have done a few legendary campaigns, mostly just for the experience and to say I've done them and tried them. I didn't really enjoy them. And again, much like the battles, it was challenging for the wrong reasons, which just made it frustrating, and you feel cheated a lot of the time. Which is what I believe drives most people that play on legendary to simply cheese it, which is pretty much what it's become about. Bringing doom stacks or spamming archers, making it so the AI pretty much can't win against your army in the auto-resolve, and you win all your battles by auto-resolving and not actually fighting anything. Or you bring 20 mammoths and make it unwinnable for the AI on the battlefield anyway, which ultimately is a massive contradiction. You play on the hardest difficulty, assumedly for the challenge, yet you eliminate the challenge by cheesing it and taking advantage of all the exploits to make it super easy for yourself. To me, that makes no sense. If you want to make things super easy and just win, just go and play on easy. For that reason, it just seems that legendary difficulty has become kind of a flex for people to say, look how good I am at Total War, I play on legendary. When in fact they just cheese it and there's actually not a lot of skill involved at all. For me, when I played legendary, I tried to do it as I normally do, with balanced armies and playing kind of quote-unquote properly. But playing this way on legendary, the campaign buffs that the AI gets are just too much, and it feels more cheaty than challenging, and for me, that is not enjoyable. But that's just me personally, that's my personal opinion. If you're someone who plays on legendary and you cheese it, or you play on a lesser difficulty and cheese it, have at it. It's your game, you paid money for it, it's a single player game, you're not hurting anybody, play it however you like. However, if you really want the most fun challenge and you really want to learn the game the best in terms of being able to transfer to multiplayer and things like that, but you could play campaign on hard or very hard and create the challenge yourself by not cheesing the game and limiting perhaps what you do. Or you could make some fun armies to mess around with. You could have a cav only army, which will improve your micro, let me tell you. You could have a monster only army. You could do a playthrough with no missile units or no artillery. You could limit yourself to only using equal amounts of armies against the enemy. so you only engage a single stack with a single stack of yours, never 2v1 or 3v1ing armies or settlements. To me, this is way more fun than running around with a doom stack, just instantly stomping everything with no challenge or thought required. It would be nice, for example, if CA put in some more options for people to toggle difficulty with, rather than simply making the AI kind of cheaty. It would be nice if there was perhaps unit caps in campaign. That would be kinda cool, so you can't bring 12 dragons or 19 units of archers. You'll be forced to actually play the game a little bit more. But hey, who knows what'll come along in Warhammer 3. For me, for now, I've settled on very hard campaign difficulty and hard battle difficulty. This is where I find campaigns the most enjoyable and still pretty challenging, provided that I limit myself and don't resort to any kind of cheese, of course, because any idiot can spam 19 archers. As for the Chaos Invasion, this is one of the nice new options that CA has added to add a bit of difficulty to the game, which I think is challenge in the right way. The bigger the Chaos Invasion difficulty, the more armies will spawn, and thus the bigger the challenge to have to deal with, and perhaps the more lore friendly it's going to be, because the Chaos will actually be somewhat of a threat to you. So whatever difficulty you're playing on, if you fancy a lore friendly or pretty big challenge, then crank up that Chaos Invasion difficulty and pray to Sigmar, or hope that they get destroyed by all the other factions on the way between you and the Chaos, and then there's not really much of a challenge. But hey, there's the potential for challenge, goddammit. But there we go. There's a lot of the main differences between the difficulties in battle and in campaign. There's not really a right or wrong answer, it's personal preference on how you want to play the game. Do you want to be a bit more casual? Do you want to get hardcore challenge? Do you really want to learn how to play Total War properly? Or do you get something out of cheesing the game and finding exploits? Whatever your reason is, if you find yourself getting bored, then you're probably making it too easy for yourself. If you find yourself getting frustrated, maybe you're getting cheated by the difficulty, or there's just some stuff you haven't learnt yet. Either way, like I say, there's no wrong answer, it's a single player game, you're not hurting anybody however you play, so go for it. But these are my opinions and my thoughts and my advice for Total War difficulty. I hope you've enjoyed this, thanks for watching, I'll see you in the future.